Welcome everybody to the Institute of International European Affairs. My name is Alex White. I'm the Director General here. And I thought that just in the context of the discussion and the presentation that we have from our distinguished guest, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, Volker Türk, that it would be appropriate that we would that I should just mention and note the very sad passing of Professor Conor Gearty, who was a good close friend of the Institute here. In fact, he addressed us just within the last year. A friend to many academics, lawyers, people involved in human rights, and a huge loss. I mean, a really, really huge loss to all of us, I think, obviously, principally to his family, his young family. But I think he will leave a huge gap. And I think it is appropriate that we should mark Conor's passing and just note the huge accomplishments that he had and reflect on how sad it is that he has left us at such a young age. So on that sad note, but this is an important, as I'm sure Conor will appreciate, very important presentation and opportunity for discussion on the kinds of issues that Conor was so dedicated to. It's my pleasure to hand over now this morning to Professor Catherine Costello, who's UCD Full Professor of Global Refugee and Migration Law. And Catherine will introduce our distinguished guest and moderate the event. Catherine.
Great. Thank you so much, Alex, and welcome everybody. And thanks especially for those kind remarks about Conor Gearty, just such a beacon for human rights scholarship, somebody who really in his academic work and as a public intellectual really embodied the spirit of human rights in the sense that he never accepted orthodoxies about human rights, but was always on the side of the oppressed and on making the commitment of human rights real, something he shares with our speaker today. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event, which is part of the Institute's Future Proofing Europe series, kindly supported by the Department of Foreign Affairs. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Catherine Costello, as was mentioned. I'm a return migrant to Ireland after over 20 years in the UK and in Germany, and very pleased to have returned to Irish academia to the Sutherland School of Law 2 years ago. I'm delighted to welcome you here today. In particular, in the audience, we have His Excellency Noel White, the Irish Permanent Representative to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, reflective of the importance of our speaker today, Volker Türk, who is, as you know, United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Volker is going to address us on the role that human rights can and indeed must play in a world that seems ever more polarized and conflict-stricken. Before I introduce Volker, I'd like to call on Gerard Keown, who is a political director of the Department of Foreign Affairs, to say a few words.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Catherine, for the introduction. Thank you, Alex, for hosting this meeting here today at the Institute. It's a great honor for me to introduce our guest speaker at the Institute, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Türk. I know we're all looking forward with great expectation to what the High Commissioner will say to us in his address this morning on the topic of human rights, healing our fractured world. I would also like to acknowledge the great work that the High Commissioner and his team have accomplished during his term in office. I think we can all say with certainty that there has probably never been a time of greater challenge to the work of upholding universal human rights and seeing the promise of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, adopted with such great hope over 75 years ago, upheld in our world today. And yet, High Commissioner, and we thank you for this, we see that you continue and still succeed in making the case for human rights, and that case needs to be made every day, as we know, for the reasons that you will set out for us. And you can certainly count on Ireland's unstinting support in the work that you do. For our world is indeed fractured and fragmented, and I welcome that you've chosen to come to talk to us at this time. It's a great honor to have you here in Ireland. Human rights have been central to Ireland's foreign policy since the very beginning. A commitment to multilateralism, to the rule of law, has guided us from our first steps on the international stage over a century ago. It has underpinned the commitment to achieving peace in our own country, and created the conditions that led to the Good Friday Agreement and to peace in Northern Ireland. It has also underpinned our long tradition of peacekeeping, humanitarianism, and to development cooperation, as well as our strong adherence to this and support for the values that underpin the European Union, a community founded on law, and of course the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. These are values we seek to live every day. As you witness the terrible conflicts, the failure to respect international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law that is occurring globally, including on our own conflict, in too many conflicts, whether that be in Palestine, in Ukraine, in Sudan, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in too many places all over our world, or whether it be the pushback on women's rights and gender equality globally, or on the rights of LGBTIQ+ citizens that again we witness in too many parts of our world. Our response can only be to strengthen our commitment to uphold human rights and to defend the multilateral system that underpins them. For this reason, Ireland has decided to put itself forward as a candidate for election to the Human Rights Council for the term 2027 to 2029. We are conscious that this is not an easy time for human rights, that their universality and indivisibility is everywhere being questioned, that in some countries, rights and freedoms which have been taken granted for many years are now in doubt. Next week, at the United Nations General Assembly, the Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Simon Harris, will host a high-level event where he will launch the thematic principles that will underpin Ireland's campaign for membership of the Council. Throughout the campaign to follow, and if elected during our term on the Council, we will highlight the importance of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as civil and political ones. All of these rights are important. Our pledges made on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration reiterated Ireland's commitment to the need for safe and supported civil society and for human rights defenders to carry out their work free from repression and reprisal. We also pledged our continued support to your office, High Commissioner, and we look forward to deepening this cooperation. We will, therefore, continue to stand with those defending human rights wherever they are. We will continue to place values at the center of our foreign policy, and we would stand ready to assist with healing some of the fractures in our world today. So without further pause, please let me welcome the High Commissioner Volker Türk. We look forward to hearing from you, and I'll hand back to our chair, Catherine Costello. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jared. It's a pleasure to introduce Volker Türk, who, as you know, was appointed as the 8th United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in 2022. Prior to that, he was Under Secretary General for Policy at the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General. And prior to that, we knew each other as he had a long and distinguished career in UNHCR, in particular as Assistant High Commissioner for Protection in UNHCR from 2015 to 2019, which coincided with the development of the landmark Global Compact for Refugees, really a moment when it looked like the so-called refugee crisis of 2015 was going to be a harbinger of positive change in the international community. And he and others were able to make some real progress on global responsibility sharing for refugees, which is an extraordinary legacy. He also is, like myself, a legal scholar. He has a doctorate in international law from the University of Vienna and a Master of Laws degrees from the University of Linz, also in Austria. So he's going to address us today for about 20 minutes. And just a reminder that today's event and the Q&A are both on the record. And I encourage you to think of some challenging questions, both for those in person and our online audience who will also be able to pose questions on the Zoom. So Volker, over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really great to be back here in Dublin and at the institute. And as one says in Ireland, Akarche. Akarcha. Sorry, it was probably not quite. So really pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really delighted to make this presentation in the beautiful city of Dublin. I've always been captivated by Ireland's rich oral tradition. I mean, Irish writers and poets have long understood the power of words, which reach the mind, but also go straight to the heart. Poetry, especially, has never been an art. It has resisted oppression, exposed injustice, and given voice to the excluded. Your own Seamus Heaney exemplified this, and in his work From the Republic of Conscience and Beyond, he invited us to consider the role of our deepest human values in our lives. These are the same values that underpin human rights: freedom, equality, and justice. They are not political or ideological. They resonate with our moral core as human beings. Human rights are legal obligations, but they are much more than that. And yet today, human rights are under threat. Disturbing trends are fracturing the protective edifice of international law and tearing at social cohesion. The long-established laws of war are blatantly disregarded, with virtually no accountability. Several governments are ignoring human rights law entirely or enforcing it selectively when it suits them. Others are withdrawing from international agreements and attacking global institutions and frameworks. Hate speech and discrimination against minorities are driving us further apart. Inequalities are deepening. But while human rights are coming under attack, they are also the medicine we need to help our fractured world to heal. Distinguished guests, I see three areas where human rights offer a path forward. Let me begin with war, the ultimate violation of human rights, which is evident in so many conflicts around the world. In fact, we have probably some 60 countries now with over 120 conflicts that are taking place there, which is the highest number since the end of the Second World War. From Gaza to Sudan, to Myanmar, to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We are witnessing utter disregard for civilian life and obstructing life-saving aid, attacks on markets, on schools, just today in Myanmar, again on health facilities, are shockingly commonplace and grave breaches of international law. The Russian Federation has intensified its attacks and its assault on Ukraine along the front line and on various cities. Recent weeks have witnessed some of the most massive airstrikes since the war began. And we know this with these countrywide drone and missile saturation attacks that are resuming and increasing. My team, I have a team on the ground, has been documenting widespread and systematic torture and ill treatment, including sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilians who are arbitrarily detained. Israel's mass killing of Palestinian civilians and its extensive destruction in Gaza, its blocking of sufficient quantities of life-saving aid, and the ensuing starvation of civilians, its killing of journalists, of UN staff, of NGO workers, and its repeated war crimes are a shock to our humanity. Israel has a case to answer before the International Court of Justice, and the evidence continues to mount. Peace has never been more urgent. Gaza is in ruins. Israel is still suffering profound trauma from the horrific 7 October attacks, which I have repeatedly condemned, and the remaining hostages and their families are in agony. It's clear for the international community there needs to be action, stop the flow of arms to Israel that may violate international law, press for a ceasefire, the release of hostages, but also detainees, secure humanitarian access, and oppose military takeover and annexation, including in the West Bank, while supporting the right to self-determination of the Palestinians. Against this tragic backdrop, Some leaders are celebrating violence. Pro-war propaganda is expanding. And if you look at global military spending, it has reached an all-time high of $2.7 trillion. That is nearly 13 times the amount that the world's wealthiest nations spent on official development assistance. Public budgets often demonstrate what matters most to states. And here the message is loud and clear: weapons over dialogue. But lasting security cannot be achieved by military spending alone. There is another, and of course I would say better way of doing it. And human rights show the path out of conflict by putting people at the center of mediation and peace building and insisting on accountability. Independent monitoring and universal standards offer a basis of facts and neutral ground to bring warring parties to the table, because you need to accept the facts first because you can actually negotiate anything. My office documents and reports on human rights violations in conflict and crisis zones around the world. My staff, my colleagues on the ground in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Gaza, Haiti, Sudan, Ukraine, and everywhere else where they work to shed light on violations and abuses. This is an important contribution to future accountability, but it does cost money. In these challenging times, the people of Ireland are a source of inspiration. Your long history of taking action against injustice and calling for accountability are reflected in Ireland's generous support to my office, both political and financial. Your commitment is an investment in peace, because as Ireland knows well, when the guns go silent, human rights also help societies to deal with the difficult legacies of colonialism, of inequality, and conflict. Transitional justice tools promote truth-telling, reconciliation, and peace. During my recent visits to countries around the world, to Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Serbia, and Syria, among others, the need for accountability for serious violations, justice for the families of missing people, and truth-telling were front and center. This was the very clear message that we got from the people I had a chance to meet in these countries. We know how human rights can help prevent conflict. Our work has shown time and again that when discrimination against communities is ignored, when civic space for dialogue is shut down, when dehumanization is tolerated and even empowered, then grievances fester and tensions build. So we need to invest much more at the national and global levels in heeding early warnings and in building peace by investing in dialogue and confidence-building measures. This is closely linked to the second area I would like to touch on, civic space. Ireland is a champion of the vital work of human rights defenders worldwide, and I'm very happy that Mary Lawler is with us, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. Free speech, dissent, and the right to peaceful protest are essential to building strong, resilient societies. But today, governments in every region around the world are cracking down on dissent, both online and offline. Authorities are using excessive force against demonstrators and activists and restricting the right to peaceful protest. Human rights defenders are being threatened, criminalized, or worse. Around the world, at least 625 human rights defenders and media workers were killed or disappeared in 2024. According to the data gathered by my office, that is one every 14 hours. Elections are a touchstone for freedom of expression and civic space. Unfortunately, we see both under attack in several countries that are entering electoral periods on the African continent, Latin America, and in other parts of the world. And what we see very often is this pattern of authorities harassing, excluding, or detaining opposition leaders, restricting media freedom, banning peaceful protest, and silencing human rights defenders. By monitoring these developments and drawing attention to them, my office has an important role in countering tensions, preventing violence before it even breaks out. We provide facts that should spur action by the international community. Restrictions on civic space are not only deeply unjust, they are counterproductive. Political participation is one of the best tools we have for effective, accountable, and transparent public policy. Listening to people's demands for better healthcare, for decent work, for adequate housing, to tackle corruption through peaceful dialogue can lay the foundation for stable, resilient societies. People need to be given the opportunity to participate meaningfully in policy decisions that affect them, to express themselves without fear of violence or harm, and to question public decisions and call for change. And we need to make special efforts to ensure the most marginalized, women, minorities, migrants, those living in poverty, people with disabilities are included in these decisions. This brings me to my third point, an issue that defines the lives of millions of people around the world, but rarely makes the headlines. We need to tackle inequalities and adopt economies that deliver much better for all people. More than 40% of the global population live in countries that spend more on servicing their debt than on either education or health. More than half of low-income countries are currently in or at high risk of debt distress. And you can imagine the consequences of that. But the development finance they need is dwindling as major economies shift their priorities and expand defense budgets to record levels. Global poverty reduction has stalled. Trade wars always hit the most vulnerable hardest. Higher tariffs could put healthcare and education out of reach for many people around the world. They also have a disproportionate impact on jobs traditionally done by women, which could roll back gains that we have achieved on gender equality in particular. So we need justice in global trade and finance, and all countries should be able to invest in the human rights of their people, in particular economic, social, and cultural rights. This was one of the goals of the Pact for the Future that, as you know, was adopted last year by all countries in the General Assembly. What we are trying to achieve, especially with this concept of a new economy, of a human rights economy, is also that, and this was repeated in the Pact for the Future, that it challenges the idea that economic growth is the only measure of a country's success, an idea that has contributed to the denial of human rights, the destruction of our climate and our environment over decades. I think it's really important to change that measure as quickly as one can. As I mentioned, we have developed this concept of a human rights economy in which all economic policies, from taxation and public spending to climate action and the just transition, focus on advancing human rights and protecting our planet. Because very often you will see that economists are not, and those who are involved in fiscal policies, very rarely know much about human rights, including the obligations that a state has accepted. And as a result, we really hope that economic planning, fiscal planning, ministries of finance know about the legal obligations that the state has accepted, including when it comes to economic, social, and cultural rights. And we hope that this concept of a human rights economy can deliver on the rights to health, to social protection, to education, decent work, adequate housing, justice, credible institutions, and the right to be free from discrimination. Such policies that build trust ultimately help to prevent tensions and make societies more resilient. Some of the most successful movements in history including for civil rights, for women's rights, anti-racism, anti-apartheid, LGBTQ+, climate justice, were steered by people who were guided by equality and justice, the values that underpin our human rights. Ireland knows this well. Your long history of struggle against foreign domination and your fight for independence and justice inform your strong stand for human rights, dignity, and equality for all people everywhere. In all my visits from Sudan, Bangladesh, Serbia, Syria, I am reminded of the universality of human rights and that they resonate deeply with people, because sometimes there is this myth that human rights are not universal. Well, if you talk to all the ones who are part of social movements these days, be it in Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Sudan, or anywhere else, for them that's an abstract discussion that has got absolutely nothing to do with the realities that they live. This also gives me hope. Many of us, more than we think, are committed to these values. Studies consistently show that a huge majority of the world's people support justice, they support accountability and freedom from discrimination. And at a time when anti-rights narratives are gaining ground and budgets for human rights are being cut, we need to seize that momentum. We are working to inspire an alliance of member states, philanthropies, civil society, and others to defend international human rights and humanitarian law and to strengthen the entire human rights ecosystem. I presented this idea to member states and others last week in my opening to the Human Rights Council, and I very much hope that the government of Ireland, the Irish civil society will play a major role in line with your leadership on human rights around the world. People often feel powerless or helpless in the face of mounting conflict, hate, and division. But human rights bring the energy for change. They are a moral compass, an ideal that inspires, that captures the imagination, and a framework of practical, concrete steps. Human rights belong to all of us, so all of us need to protect them. And to echo Heaney's powerful words, we are all ambassadors of conscience, entrusted with a mandate to defend our shared values. Let us not remain indifferent in the face of violations. One action for human rights can spark hope, and hope can change history. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Volker, for those very sobering, candid, and yet beautiful words about human rights in today's world. So I'd invite questions, and if you have them, also to introduce yourself, whether you're online or here in the room. And I gather, Volker, you'd prefer to take a few questions together, so we might cluster 2 or 3 at a go. If you'd like to start us off.
Ronan Tynan, I'm a filmmaker, and I have a particular interest in human rights. It's like the last film I did, Bringing Assad to Justice. They all have a unique human rights element. And that brings me to one of the key points you made. People do feel powerless. And I will put it to you very clearly that people are right to feel powerless. Because even the way you address this today and the way we talk about human rights and the way we've kind of almost intellectualized it, we make it easy to normalize a genocide in Gaza. In fact, you did it, and I respect you enormously, and I'm not just trying to be provocative, but I have many friends who were brutally tortured and murdered in Syria. That documentary was made with the help of many of those people, and it still pains me today because what I see in Gaza, I saw repeatedly for years in Syria. The systematic bombing of hospitals, systematic murder of medical people, systematic bombing of schools, starvation sieges, with even Alex de Waal saying the UN should have used the word famine to describe the sieges in Syria. And Israelis, I know, saw what happened and studied what happened in Syria. And more than once when I was challenged about Gaza, I was said, look at Assad in Syria, because I knew I was quite expert in that area. Do you see the point I'm making? We did nothing about Syria. We normalized it. And now we're normalizing genocide in Gaza, because I really expected a little different, a dramatically different presentation. Because when you have a genocide being live streamed, this is not just disillusioning. This is an indictment of the entire system. It says human rights are now irrelevant, that campaigning seems to be a futile exercise when you see this kind of systematic murder, when Western states in particular continue to trade with Israel. And let's be brutally honest about it. The hypocrisy involved in the way we rightly challenge Putin on Ukraine, we rightly call them out. You've got a team in Ukraine, quite rightly. You have no one in Gaza. I haven't seen you at the border trying to get a campaign in. I'm just trying to say to you that really you need a much more radical approach, because we all need a much more radical approach. You know, we all need to ask ourselves, what are we doing? Like, I could be very provocative and say, has UCD, for example, boycotted Israeli universities? Has the law department taken that initiative? It's too easy to normalize the genocide when we talk like this. Like, I know some of these genocide scholars. Omar Bartov did not call it a genocide at the beginning, but now over 80% of the International Association of Genocide Scholars have called it a genocide. Over 80%, many of them leading Israeli scholars like Omar Bartov. So against that background, I'm saying to you, we need a much more radical approach. I would respectfully suggest, I'm asking, are you working on some radical approach, recognizing the dramatic failure of, shall we say, the architecture designed after World War II to prevent genocide, for example? And after Syria, I mean, we've been alerted to this absolute catastrophe repeatedly, day after day. And if we continue to make speeches like you've made, and we continue to intellectualize the process, we're avoiding the central issue, that even the laws of war were designed when big armies fought each other. But that's not the way war is fought anymore. So I think you get my point, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Will we still take two more? Yeah. Anyone else in the room or online? I have a couple. Oh yeah, here, did you want to go next? And then I'll take one online as well. Yes.
Hi, Commissioner. I'm Ed O'Donovan. I work with Mary Lawler, and thank you for your thought-provoking speech. One of the things that strikes me is we've just passed the 3rd anniversary of your office's assessment of the human rights situation in Xinjiang. And given China's intransigence and its growing importance to the UN, I'm just curious how your office is working to implement some of those excellent recommendations which were made 3 years ago and which we've seen very little evidence of being implemented. Thank you.
And I might just put one of the online questions because it's thematically related. We have a question from Matt O'Neill. Also about Gaza and Ukraine, but specifically about estimates about human rights violations against children in both settings, and very specifically asking you if you are frustrated at the slow pace in the EU at taking concrete and serious action against the Israeli government over Gaza.
Look, on the first one, I think it is extremely important to know where the origins of international humanitarian law and international human rights law are coming from. 2 world wars, genocide, Holocaust, atrocity crimes, which is when that feeling after the end of the Second World War with this never again, they established a normative system that was meant to be the measure of how wars are to be conducted, how international human rights law has to be respected. Well, in the last 80 years, we have seen a lot of failures on many fronts. I mean, you mentioned Syria, well, Rwanda, you can go through the whole list. It doesn't take away the value of the law. And in fact, if you look at, just to give you the example on Ukraine, the recent judgment of the European Court of Human Rights quoted my reports, I think 500 times. So the fact that we were able to document what was happening actually has legal value. The same, by the way, on Gaza. I don't have a team of international staff in Gaza or in the West Bank because the Israeli government doesn't allow this, has stopped cooperation with us, so has not allowed us to have international staff on the ground. But I have still national staff, and I have a remote team that works out of Jordan in order to do the reporting that we have been doing to the Council on a regular basis, where we document not only what's happening in terms of crimes against humanity, war crimes, all the evidence that we see that leads us to make sure that Israel is held to account when it comes before the International Court of Justice on the genocide case. Of course, there is huge frustration about the lack of reaction to what is happening, including by the European Union. I remember the previous High Representative came to see me once very early on to ask what was happening in the High Representative for the European Union, Borrell, very frustrated with what is happening. And I hope that everyone wakes up in Europe and realizes that this is not only a question of double standards when you look at what's happening in the reaction to Ukraine, but something to be answered for in the future. And there is a real reckoning, a moral reckoning that has to happen on that front. We will continue to do our utmost to document what is happening, to say it as it has to be said, both when it comes to the Gaza situation as well as on the West Bank. And by the way, when it comes to Syria, it was a very similar situation. My office was not allowed to ever set foot in Syria for the last, well, 56 years, but certainly ever since the civil war started. I was the first High Commissioner to be able to visit Syria at the beginning of the year after the fall of the Assad regime. And we have, as a result, quite a lot of credibility with the Syrian people and the civil society because we were with them during all these horrible periods that you have described. And exactly. And I think we are now obviously hoping to be having a much stronger presence inside Syria because, of course, the situation is extremely dire as well. Look, on Xinjiang, our report is an important one. There are very strong recommendations. I said to the Council last year, I have said it now on 2 occasions that I'm very frustrated with the lack of progress. And in particular when it comes to criminal law reform and family separation issues, because some of the things have changed, but the fundamental issues of criminal law reform has not. I mean, you can be arrested at any point in time, end up in prison on trumped up national security and so-called terrorism charges. And that is a huge, huge issue of concern. But we do have a regular dialogue with them. And we keep pushing, asking, doing whatever we can so that these recommendations are taken seriously. And that's extremely important, not just in relation, by the way, to Xinjiang, but also to Hong Kong, to the national security law that was adopted, or to Tibet, and to civic space more generally, because it's not just about minority groups, it's also about civic space and the need for an open public space where dissent, where different opinions can be voiced without fear. Yes, and on the last question, yes, of course, hugely frustrated with the lack of progress that we see when it comes to a uniform European Union position on Gaza.
Right. Thank you, Volker. Another here, and anybody else down the, yeah, there. I see 2 hands. Okay.
Good morning, High Commissioner. Thank you for your words and welcome to Dublin. I want to just touch a little bit on what is essentially a global realignment of the budgetary situation, which is for many organizations supporting defenders has been catastrophic. I'm interested to know the strategies within your office, within the organization, as to how the issue of protection and that of human rights defenders in particular can continue to be prioritized during this budgetary calamitous situation. And of course, as the money drops, the needs increase due to the general global chaos. I'd be interested in the thoughts from a perhaps more strategic or structural perspective within your organization. Thank you.
Thank you. And then here, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Hello, good morning. My name is Trinity. I work for Amnesty International. But my question is more on fascism. There's a rising concern on fascism in not only Europe, in the Americas. And I would like you to comment, especially because it's something we've seen before. I'm particularly young, just 22 years old. And so it's something that I've just read in history books. And now it seems that we're living in it. And there's a very thin line on freedom of expression and hate speech. And many of us, maybe in the West, love playing jump rope with that, thin line that is. So would you care to comment on the, growing issue on fascism, considering it's an economic issue as well, and particularly how it affects marginalized groups, whether it's here, refugees, or in Africa, because there's a rising concern for, particularly in Congo, in the western part of Congo, where diamonds are mined. There are people who are being exploited, women who are being raped, and we have become very desensitized to, particularly, I will say, Black bodies, because there is no period in time where the massacre, the genocides of Black people has been taken like it really matters. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Question for the Times for sure. Anybody else down the back? Maybe I can't see. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your speech. I'm Seamus Allen, a researcher here at the Institute. I wanted to ask, you talked about media freedom and the stifling of protests, particularly in Africa and in Latin America. Can you just comment on the importance of media freedom and perhaps even social media freedom when it comes to documenting and having evidence about human rights abuses? And then just a second question, can you comment on the situation in Europe and even in the United States, particularly, say, Germany, the United Kingdom, where we're seeing perhaps criminalization of protest? Thank you so much.
Good.
Yeah.
On the budget question, look, it's disastrous for human rights organizations around the world, and particularly for human rights defenders and civil society organizations at the grassroots level, because one of the main funders, US, has basically cut the funding from one day to the next. And wherever I go, I hear it from grassroots organizations that they don't have the funding anymore. So I think we should all be aware that this will lead to a weakening of the human rights system. Because if you don't have the funding, and if you are also in some of these countries where there's much more authoritarianism, if you're also ending up in a situation where you can't, or where you oppress as a result of what you document and what you say, it's almost a double hit on human rights defenders, civil society organizations around the world, and it's extremely worrying. By the way, and this is not just for grassroots organizations, it's also for the United Nations. I mean, my own office has been hit quite hard. I mean, we are losing at least about a quarter of our income this year, which is massive because we already were quite underfunded. Special rapporteurs can only do one country visit, for example. Treaty bodies can only meet twice, not 3 times a year, which means all the ripple. It sounds a bit abstract, but that actually means that accountability mechanisms of sorts are not there to provide precisely the space that is needed in order to raise human rights issues. I have asked philanthropists, the philanthropic foundations, to really see this as a very critical existential moment. Of course, we hope that there is a realization when you see that defense budgets are going up, that military budgets and defense budgets are not going to be, that the world is not becoming more secure by doing only by increasing military spending, but also to realize that if you weaken the human rights system at its core, you end up with a much more insecure world in the future. To actually say that military defense or even national security, if people are so much interested in national security, they need to see that human rights is part of it. An investment in human rights when it comes to early warning, early action is absolutely critical. And I'm not sure that realization has yet sunk in. it's going to be very important to keep making that point compellingly and to show concretely how you can actually prevent things from happening or mitigating things to some extent. And that's really what the human rights work is all about. On fascism and generally extremism, anti-rights agendas, and so forth. I think the biggest problem is societies are much more divided, and there is so much dehumanization going on, especially against vulnerable groups, people of African descent in some parts of the world, people with disabilities, LGBTQ+ communities, all kinds of minorities. It's this typical, and that comes from fascism studies, the scapegoating issue. You identify a group, you target that group, you attack it, you dehumanize it, which I think we know from history is a very dangerous and a very slippery slope, because if the dehumanization starts with one group, it doesn't end there. It continues. And if I look at political debates today, even in the Western world, well, very much in the Western world, I see the same binary black and white attitude. The enemy, your political opponent, is considered an enemy. Sometimes we even see the label of terrorism used, for political opponents, which is extremely dangerous. And I think it really goes back to the importance of making sure that we regain the public square where there can be robust debates and disagreements. And there, free and independent media play an incredibly important role. I think the question of media freedoms comes in, because why do we need free and independent media? Because we need to have an agreement on facts, and we need to have a discussion about how to interpret the facts. And that needs to be a discussion that is allowed and not suppressed. And yes, I am worried also in Europe and elsewhere about media freedoms. We see it, I expressed it even publicly in relation to developments in the US, but also in Europe, where one of the studies by the European Commission has identified a negative trend when it comes to freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, including in relation to what's happening in Gaza, for example. And that is indeed an area of great concern. So we should all be very much alert to that, because if you start to allow this, it's a very slippery slope.
Right, thank you. I have one very, maybe a nice follow-on question from the online audience, and then we'll open to the room again. So this is a question from Guy Banham, and he asks, given the risks to rights and freedoms from big tech's role in algorithmic polarization, what steps could Ireland take to apply the idea of a human rights economy in the digital sphere and ensure the accountability of private companies? Or maybe to rephrase it, can Ireland be the home of big tech and a beacon for human rights at the same time?
You have other questions?
Yeah, Siobhan, I think. Yeah, next. Yeah.
Siobhan Mullally, UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons and Professor of Human Rights Law at Galway. Thank you very much for your presentation, High Commissioner. I just had a quick comment in relation to Gaza, and remembering, of course, our friend Conor Gearty, who wrote extensively on human rights after Gaza and whether international law can survive this moment. I do think the Office of the High Commissioner has a role, not just in documenting, but really a leadership role in calling for prevention of genocide, as you have done, but also at this moment naming it, given the accumulation of evidence over the last 2 years and over an extended period beyond that. And that failing to do that is actually, at this moment, I think, undermining our calls for justice and accountability. I had 2 brief questions. One is in relation to migration and rights of refugees. And as you note, in particular, the scapegoating of people. And in Ireland, we've seen this, and across Europe, the scapegoating of asylum seekers, migrants and refugees, and the hatred underpinning that is really destabilizing democracy and the protection of human rights. We've seen a significant pushback against the application of human rights law to the rights of refugees and migrants, and also in particular at this moment in the European Union. And I hope that Ireland will have a key role in prevention of that. But what more can we do to ensure the effective application of human rights law to the rights of refugees and migrants, and to prevent this scapegoating, but also this exceptionalizing of migration and refugee protection as somehow outside of ordinary human rights and constitutional law protections? And then a very quick question on the Democratic Republic of Congo. That was my official country visit this year. And it is, and your office has been repeatedly reporting on the devastating human rights violations, including in the context of the conflict, but also the extraction of mineral resources and wealth. A state that is so powerful with such resources available to it. Why is it that conflict is continuing, that peace has not been secured, that there is not more effective human rights protection? And your office is doing, and your staff, they're doing incredible work, but with very, very limited resources and capacity. MONUSCO is facing dwindling resources and capacity, and an almost impossible task of protecting civilians. So what more can we do to ensure that this doesn't go off the agenda, that this seems to me to be a conflict and a human rights crisis that could be resolved, but we don't seem to be able to get the sustained attention needed for that. Thanks.
Thanks, Siobhan. One more maybe in the room. Yeah, just from the back there.
Yep. You've mentioned previously that like governments are kind of failing to react to different abuses all around the world. And we've started to see that people have started to stand up for themselves. We've seen in Germany, human rights activist Kitty O'Brien stood up again to peacefully protest against the genocide in Gaza, and she was beaten by the German police. I've also seen the Gaza Freedom Flotilla being targeted as well by suspected drones attacks. I'm just wondering, what is your stance on that, and what will you do to help human rights defenders who are standing up and who are being targeted? Thank you.
Look, on the big tech companies, I think what we see is a phenomenon of the accumulation of power with private actors that is frightening. And it should frighten us all, because we see what's happening, especially on the algorithms. And I fully agree that this is probably one of the biggest challenges that we face, because it also has this adverse impact on social cohesion within societies. I mean, we see hate speech becoming the new normal on so many fronts, and the loss of any nuance in any public debate. And social media definitely play an incredible role when it comes to this, especially the way that they're set up. And we haven't really found the alternative to this, and which brings me back to, again, free and independent media, including free and independent social media that are not controlled by big tech companies. I think when it comes to the role of Ireland and the European Union more generally, I mean, you have a number of regulations: the Digital Service Act, Digital Market Act, the AI Act. I mean, and they are very important, because there is this resistance to regulation, which, frankly, from our perspective, is absolutely cardinal. You need regulation. I mean, I'm always stunned by, when you look at pharmaceutical products, for example, the type of tests that has to be done before you are actually able to put any medication on the market is rigorous. And yes, we are grateful that it is rigorous, because we don't want to take any medication that would actually harm us. But you don't have this with the type of products that we see on the tech side. We don't, I mean, anyone can put all kinds of material out there, not knowing necessarily even the consequences of it, and then see what happens. I mean, we know the role that Facebook played in Myanmar, for example, where it was the one social media tool where hate speech and the incitement to violence were rampant. They had one one person who understood the local language, but only Bamar, didn't realize, what type of hate speech was going on against the Rohingya in 2017, when you then saw this massive ethnic displacement and the massive human rights violations against the Rohingya. So I think there's a lot to be answered for, and frankly, the only way to do it is by regulation, both at the national level and at the international level. But then you have the other type. You have the cybercrime issues, which of course cybercrime is an important issue, but you then go into the overreach, and some authoritarian governments are using it precisely to suppress dissent and freedom of expression. And I mean, Bangladesh is a good example. There was a cybercrime law that was really used in order to suppress the opposition in a massive way. And so that's why human rights, in a way, is the tool to look at all of this, including from the guiding principles. There are these guiding principles on business and human rights, and they offer not only that you have to do a human rights impact assessment, you need to do a due diligence, you need to see what type of products, what type of effect will they have, and not just in one part of the world, but across the world, because of course these things mean different things in different contexts. And yeah, for me, the most important one is actually with the Global Digital Compact that was adopted last year, so the Pact for the Future, we need a very strong global governance system that regulates it. I mean, you have the IIEA when it comes to nuclear energy. I mean, you probably need something similar eventually for some of these potential digital developments that we see, in particular generative AI. I think the migration refugee debate is one where, I mean, especially after 2015, it has become very toxic, I find, in the political debate. I mean, it is not borne out by facts anymore. You have emotions that dictate it, and it is used by one side of the political spectrum, the extreme right, and the populists to make it even more toxic. And that is a real problem, because you can only deal with migration and refugee issues on the basis not only of the evidence, of the facts, but also of the law that exists. And again, one of the big achievements after the horrible events of the first part of last century were precisely the right to seek and enjoy asylum. The freedom of movement more generally, and when it comes to migration, and to prevent the phenomenon of trafficking, contemporary forms of slavery, to be halted. And unfortunately, that can only be done in an evidence-based way, which does not put the dehumanization of the other at the forefront, and actually controls and counters the dehumanization. And even, and I have had a chance to talk with civil society here in Ireland, we had a discussion about integration. And integration measures are obviously very important when it comes to refugees and migrants, but and one of the participants mentioned to me, well, it's beyond integration, it also has to go into full inclusion. What does full inclusion mean in a society? And that is a much more complex process. It's a whole of society effort, and it's one that one needs to do very consciously with all segments of a society. And we often see it play out at the very local level, because I remember in my own country, in Austria, in 2015, those communities that never saw a migrant or a refugee were the ones that were more hostile. The ones, even in the rural areas where in the past they haven't seen refugees, once they got to know them, suddenly the whole picture changed. And it doesn't take away some of the real issues around integration and around full inclusion, and one has to tackle them. I mean, there are issues, that's very clear, and they need to be tackled. But the problem of today is an extremely emotionalized, toxic debate in Europe, and which probably leads to extremes on all sides of the political spectrum that are not going to give us the answers in order to tackle the migration and refugee issues that we face in the world. And I think the two global compacts on migration and refugee were very important ones because they actually set out a blueprint for what can best be done to tackle the issue of migration and refugees. Look, human rights defenders are human rights defenders. It's not a question of global south or global north. I mean, it's absolutely critical. And I mentioned it before. I am worried about civic space also in EU countries when it comes to sometimes excessive use of force by law enforcement against protesters, for example. And that needs to be dealt with. And the acceptance that freedom of assembly, freedom of protest includes every section. And that is part of the human rights ecosystem. I mean, we have in Europe the advantage of a very strong legal system. We have the European Convention on Human Rights. So that is a guarantee precisely to ensure that these excesses that we sometimes see are prevented and mitigated in the future.
Right, thank you very much. Maybe we'll just take one more question and then we'll have to wrap up, I think, Mary.
I have two questions. One is really picking up on what you were saying about divided societies and how people are identified and targeted and attacked and dehumanized. And we see that all over the world. And it kind of tied into something that Mary Robinson said about, you know, we have to start trying to think about how to tackle cultural wars. And if you had, and I talked about possible communications. So if you could maybe say something about that. And then the other thing is just something I grapple with all the time, is sort of the lack of political will when states are driven by their own political and strategic interests. How do you work with that? You know, what do you think are the possibilities for progress on that kind of toxic environment?
I think that'll have to be the final question. I'm conscious you have a busy day. And
Right.
Yeah.
Look, on the divided society, I think if I were to give us all a task, I would say, how do we overcome division and polarization in our societies? And of course, it's amplified very much by social media. That's very clear because you see people in their bubbles and ecosystems, and you don't actually have a discussion where you can agree to disagree and think that this is right. I mean, we have to agree to disagree on certain things, and that's fine. But we have lost a little bit that space, and that's very dangerous for societies, especially for democracies, and where you need precisely this open public square where you can discuss things. And I think that human rights offers something in that regard because it is still the framework when it comes to freedom of expression, but also when it comes to hate speech and incitement to violence, and of course it's not allowed under human rights law. I mean, sometimes that's also forgotten. In the speech last week, I mentioned they're the ones who promote freedom of expression, but only when it comes to their own opinions. But when it comes to silencing any dissenting opinions, they quickly come and say this is, you know, now something else. So we need a debate about this, about realizing also that if you allow the fraying of the social cohesion, at some stage it will break. And violence has often, unfortunately, been part of the equation in such circumstances. And so we need to almost offer this alternative where I mean, today, I mean, those who are in political office, you rarely hear them speak about compassion or about kindness or about civic duties and so forth. And you actually need that. You don't need the chauvinistic, almost supremacist exceptionalism type thing. We need an alternative politics, and one that I think, if I listen to young people in particular, mean, I see this yearning on their part for precisely that. And I also think that, as I mentioned before, the vast majority of people want this good thing to have. They don't want the divisiveness, and they don't want to be caught up constantly in this negativity, in this spiral of negativity. They want to be able to act and do things. And I think the nuances, when you lose the nuances, when everything becomes binary, when everything, either you're for me or you're against me, and when that mentality is becoming the new normal, yes, you will have lost a lot of human ingenuity and creativity that you actually need to tackle the big challenges of our time. So I think that's a big communication challenge for all of us. I think we all need to think about it, how best to communicate about precisely values and principles and how to convey them. But also learn from good experience. The youth in the Pacific were the ones, young human rights defenders, young people who brought the case to the International Court of Justice when it comes to human rights and climate change, and then led to the advisory opinion, a fantastic advisory opinion by the International Court of Justice on that. That was young people. It wasn't governments, it was young people who managed to do this. And that shows also that power. And what was the last one? That was it, I think, yes. Yeah, the lack of political will. Yeah. No, I think you need for, I wish that in politics, everyone would look at the human rights obligations that states have themselves accepted and see this as the starting point. To give you the example of, because most of the grievances that people have, including in the Western world, are related to human rights issues. And if you don't take them seriously, you will ultimately pay a price. And again, I mean, housing issues. I know it's also an issue here in Ireland, the housing crisis. It is an issue that comes, if you look at it from a rights perspective, maybe gives you different answers than if you only look at it from a policy perspective. And that's on so many fronts, just to give you one very concrete example here. So the rights perspective in politics actually is extremely valuable because it gives you not only a framework, but also a guide that actually addresses precisely what often is needed when you have a fractured society. It gives you a way forward. It offers something by way of a solution.
Right. Thank you very much. I'm not going to attempt to summarize those comments, and I'm conscious of time, but I do think it's worth reflecting on this idea about human rights as a shared responsibility. I think part of the power of human rights is that they're legalized and they're shared standards that can guide conduct of powerful actors. And part of their value is in their roots in that never again after the Holocaust and the Second World War, but also they have to be as not just a script, but a plan of action. They have to be demanded and reinvigorated constantly through civil struggle. And I think that came through in your comments as well. So obviously, I just want to thank the Institute of International and European Affairs for hosting this event. And I know there's a lot of work that goes in the background. In particular, also to our audience. This is a wonderful audience, including ambassadors, special rapporteurs, who also work tirelessly within the UN system and really part of that architecture of holding to account at the international level. And of course, to the High Commissioner's team, including Claire Inder, his advisor who's here, who put the event together also, and naturally inviting you to join me in thanking our speaker today. Thanks, Volker.
Thank you.